Nayeli's hands trembled as she scrubbed the cracked wooden floor of her stepmother's house. The once beautiful home her late father had left behind now felt more like a prison. Io, her stepmother, lounged nearby in her ornate chair, lazily sipping tea and barking orders as if Nayeli were nothing more than a servant. With each passing day, Nayeli's hope for a better life dimmed. Her father's death had left her vulnerable, and Io had seized the opportunity to control her completely. Yet, in the quiet moments before sleep, Nayeli would stare out of the small window in her attic room, dreaming of freedom, of a life far from Io's cruelty. One afternoon, as the sun cast its harsh rays over the village, Io called Nayeli into the sitting room. The sharpness in her voice made Nayeli's heart sink. Something was wrong. Standing tall, Io smirked and delivered her decree. Nayeli was to marry Kobe, a poor farmer from the outskirts of the village. The words struck Nayeli like a blow. Kobe? A man she had never met, someone the villagers whispered about as barely surviving. It was unthinkable. Nayeli's protests were immediate, her voice trembling with both fear and anger. "You can't do this. I won't marry him." But Ayo's expression darkened, her smirk replaced by a cold, steely glare. "You'll do as I say, or you can find another place to live," she said, her voice dripping with menace. Nayeli knew exactly what that meant. With nowhere to go and no family left, she would be left homeless, abandoned to the streets. Ayo's power over her was absolute, and she wielded it mercilessly. As Nayeli stood there, tears welling up in her eyes, Ayo continued, twisting the knife. "A girl like you should be grateful anyone would take you," she sneered, her words cutting deeper than any blade. Helpless and cornered, Nayeli had no choice but to agree. Inside, her heart shattered, and the dreams she had clung to for so long seemed to slip further out of reach. That night, as Nayeli lay on her thin mattress, staring at the wooden beams above her, she couldn't stop the tears from flowing. She felt trapped, her life dictated by a woman who seemed to relish her suffering. Yet somewhere deep within, a small ember of defiance burned. If this was to be her fate, she resolved to find a way to endure it. Perhaps this poor farmer, this Kobe, was not the monster Ayo made him out to be. Or perhaps he was, and this marriage would be the final chapter of her misery. Either way, she vowed to survive, no matter the cost. The day of the wedding arrived, as plain and unremarkable as the ceremony itself. Nayeli sat stiffly in her simple white gown, stitched hastily by the village seamstress. She could barely bring herself to look at Kobe, the man who was now her husband. The small crowd of onlookers whispered among themselves, some pitying Nayeli's fate, others mocking the irony of a young woman being handed off to a man with nothing to offer. Kobe, however, stood tall and silent. His demeanor was calm, his face unreadable. When he spoke his vows, his voice carried a depth that made a few heads turn. It was steady and sincere, almost too composed for a man who was supposed to be desperate and downtrodden. Nayeli barely heard the priest's final blessing as the ceremony ended. She felt numb, her gaze fixed on the ground. As they left the makeshift altar, Kobe reached out to take her hand. His touch was firm yet gentle, but Nayeli quickly withdrew, walking ahead of him without a word. The whispers followed them as they departed, but Kobe remained silent, his expression betraying nothing. Their journey to Kobe's farm was long and exhausting. The farther they travelled, the more desolate the landscape became. The small house came into view at the edge of a forest, a simple structure surrounded by fields that seemed to stretch endlessly. It was nothing like the bustling village Nayeli had known. The isolation pressed down on her like a weight. This was to be her new home. She couldn't decide if it felt like a beginning or an end. The days that followed were harder than Nayeli had imagined. She awoke before dawn to the sound of roosters and spent hours working alongside Kobe. The tasks were grueling, tending to the crops, hauling water, and caring for the animals. Her hands, once soft, became calloused, and her body ached in ways she had never known. At first, she resented Kobe for bringing her into this life. She avoided speaking to him, replying with curt answers whenever he tried to make conversation. Yet, Kobe never raised his voice or showed anger. He worked tirelessly, taking on the heavier burdens without complaint. He would often leave small surprises for her: a bunch of wildflowers on the kitchen table, a bowl of freshly picked berries. These gestures confused Nayeli. Why was he being kind to her when she had given him nothing but coldness? But it wasn't just Kobe's kindness that unsettled her. It was the odd moments that didn't add up. Despite his claim of being a poor farmer, there were times when Kobe seemed too refined for his surroundings. Once, Nayeli caught him repairing a broken clock with tools she'd never seen before. He handled them with the precision of someone far more skilled than a simple farmer. Another time, she noticed an intricately carved wooden box tucked away in a corner of their home. When she opened it, she found coins and jewelry that looked far too valuable for someone of Kobe's supposed means. One evening, as the sun set behind the trees, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Nayeli sat on the porch, her mind swirling with unanswered questions. Kobe joined her, sitting a respectful distance away. "It's a beautiful view," he said softly, his voice breaking the silence. Nayeli glanced at him, expecting the usual simplicity in his demeanor. But there was something in his eyes that startled her, a depth, a knowing look that hinted at secrets he wasn't ready to share. "Why do you live like this?" she blurted out, unable to contain her curiosity any longer. "You don't seem like a poor farmer." Kobe smiled faintly, but didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned his gaze to the horizon. "Sometimes the life we choose isn't about what we have," he said after a moment. "It's about what we value." His words only deepened the mystery. Nayeli wanted to press him further, but the weight of the day's work and the lingering awkwardness between them held her back. As she lay in bed that night, her mind replayed his words and the peculiarities she had observed. Who was this man she had married, and why did it feel like he was hiding something beneath his quiet exterior? The days turned into weeks, and Nayeli found herself slowly adapting to life on the farm. Her resentment began to wane, replaced by a cautious curiosity about the man she shared her home with. Kobe's actions, his patience, and his quiet strength were undeniable. Yet the mystery of his true nature lingered, like a shadow cast over their lives. Unknowingly, Nayeli had begun to uncover pieces of a puzzle, one that would soon reveal a truth far beyond anything she could have imagined. The unease in Nayeli's life grew steadily, even as she tried to ignore it. It began with small, inexplicable things. She had once spotted Kobe returning from the forest with a heavy sack slung over his shoulder, his expression unusually tense. When she asked what he had been carrying, he waved her off with a light-hearted chuckle, claiming it was just firewood. But the sound of something metallic clinking inside the bag told a different story. One afternoon, while cleaning the house, she stumbled upon a drawer filled with things she could not understand. A finely crafted dagger engraved with strange symbols, parchments sealed with royal wax, and an ornate key that looked like it belonged to a castle rather than a farmhouse. She quickly shut the drawer, her heart pounding. What kind of life had she walked into? Kobe, for his part, carried on as though nothing was amiss. He still worked the fields with tireless determination, still greeted her each morning with a warm smile, still left her small gifts, fresh fruits, wildflowers, or even a neatly carved wooden pendant. Yet, his calm demeanor only fueled her suspicion. Who was he? Why did someone with so much kindness and depth live like a man with nothing? One evening, Nayeli sat by the fire after a particularly exhausting day. Her body ached from hauling water all afternoon, but she couldn't relax. Her mind kept circling back to the strange items she had found and the peculiar moments she had shared with Kobe. She was so lost in thought that she didn't hear him approach. "You've been quiet lately," Kobe said, sitting down across from her. His tone was gentle but probing, as though he could sense the storm brewing inside her. "I'm just tired," she replied curtly, avoiding his gaze. Kobe studied her for a moment, then nodded. You've been working hard. I'll take over tomorrow so you can rest. His offer caught her off guard. It wasn't the first time he had shown her such consideration, but it always surprised her how effortlessly he did so. She wanted to lash out, to accuse him of hiding something, but his genuine kindness disarmed her every time. The tension between them shifted a few days later when an incident brought them closer than ever. Nayeli had gone to the edge of the farm to gather firewood when she heard a rustling in the bushes. She froze, her heart racing. Out of nowhere, a wild boar charged toward her, its tusks gleaming in the sunlight. She screamed and stumbled backward, dropping the bundle of wood she had collected. Before she could react, Kobe appeared as if from nowhere. He positioned himself between her and the animal, his stance calm but commanding. With a single fluid motion, he drew the dagger she had once seen in the drawer. The boar charged again, but Kobe stood his ground, sidestepping at the last moment and delivering a precise blow to the animal's side. It collapsed with a final guttural cry. Nayeli sat on the ground, trembling. Kobe turned to her, his face filled with concern. "Are you hurt?" he asked, kneeling beside her. She shook her head, unable to speak. He helped her to her feet, his hand steady and reassuring. "Let's get you back to the house," he said softly, his voice as steady as ever. That night, Nayeli couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. It wasn't just that Kobe had saved her, it was how he had done it. His movements had been too precise, too practiced. It was clear he wasn't just a farmer who happened to have a dagger. He had been trained, perhaps even to fight. The next morning, as Kobe left to tend to the fields, Nayeli decided she couldn't stay in the dark any longer. She waited until he was out of sight before returning to the drawer. This time, she opened it fully and examined its contents. Among the parchments, she found one with an intricate royal seal. She carefully broke it open and began to read. The letter was addressed to Kobe but referred to him as Your Highness, and spoke of matters of state, including disputes over land and alliances with other kingdoms. Nayeli's breath caught in her throat. Your Highness. Was Kobe royalty? The words swam before her eyes as she tried to make sense of what she was reading. She quickly returned the letter and closed the drawer, her mind reeling. When Kobe returned that evening, Nayeli couldn't contain herself any longer. She stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, waiting for him to step inside. "Who are you, really?" she demanded, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and confusion. Kobe froze, his expression unreadable. "What do you mean?" he asked cautiously. "I found the letter," she said, her voice rising. "The one addressed to Your Highness. Are you some kind of prince? Why are you pretending to be a poor farmer?" Kobe sighed, running a hand through his hair. For the first time since she had met him, he looked vulnerable, even nervous. "It's not what you think," he began, but Nayeli cut him off. "Then what is it?" she snapped. "Why would someone like you marry someone like me? Why lie to me about who you are?" He stepped closer, his eyes pleading. "Nayeli, please, let me explain." "Then explain," she shouted, her frustration boiling over. "Because right now, I don't know what to believe." Kobe hesitated, as though weighing his words carefully. "I can't tell you everything, not yet," he said finally. "But I promise you, I'm not here to hurt you. Everything I've done has been to protect you." "Protect me from what?" she asked, her voice cracking. But Kobe didn't answer. Instead, he reached out to touch her arm, but she pulled away. "I need time," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. She turned and walked out of the house, leaving Kobe standing in the doorway, his face etched with regret. As Nayeli sat alone under the stars that night, her emotions warred within her. She felt betrayed, confused, and yet somehow still drawn to Kobe. The man who had saved her, shown her kindness, and shared her burdens was now a mystery she couldn't unravel. and though she didn't know it yet, the truth was far more extraordinary and dangerous than she could have imagined. The morning air was crisp, the sun casting a golden glow over the fields. Nayeli was tending to the chickens when the sound of galloping hooves shattered the quiet. She turned to see a group of men riding towards the farm, their armor gleaming in the sunlight. Her heart sank. Who were they, and what did they want? As the riders dismounted, Nayeli stepped back cautiously, her pulse quickening. The men carried an air of authority, their faces stern but respectful. One of them, a tall man with a commanding presence, removed his helmet and approached Kobe, who had just emerged from the barn. Without hesitation, the man knelt before him, bowing his head. "Your Highness," he said, his voice steady and reverent. "We've come to escort you back to the palace. The threat has been neutralized." Nayeli froze, her mind struggling to process what she had just heard. "Your Highness!" She looked at Kobe, expecting him to laugh or deny the man's words, but he didn't. Instead, he sighed deeply, as though a great weight had just been placed on his shoulders. Kobe turned to her, his expression a mix of sorrow and resignation. "Nayeli, there's something I need to tell you." She took a step back, shaking her head. "What's going on? Who are these men, and why are they calling you, Your Highness?" Kobe hesitated, then gestured for the guards to wait. He walked towards Nayeli, his eyes filled with regret. "I was going to tell you," he said quietly. I didn't know how." "Tell me what?" she demanded, her voice trembling. "That you're some kind of prince? That everything about you has been a lie?" "It wasn't a lie," he said firmly. "Not the way I feel about you, not the life we've built here. But yes, I'm a prince. My real name is Prince Okoye, and I'm the heir to the throne of Eldora." Nayeli stared at him, her mind racing. "Why would a prince live like this?" she asked, her voice laced with disbelief. Kobe, Okoye, looked away, as if searching for the right words. "Because I didn't want to be a prince," he admitted. "At least not in the way people expect. There were those in the palace who wanted me dead. People who would do anything to seize power. My father sent me away to keep me safe, and I chose to live as a commoner, far from the palace and its schemes." "But why marry me?" Nayeli asked, her voice breaking. "If you're a prince, why choose someone like me?" "Because I didn't want to marry someone who only cared about my title," he said, stepping closer. "I wanted someone who would see me for who I am, not for the crown I wear. And I found that in you." Nayeli's heart ached at his words, but she couldn't shake the feeling of betrayal. "You should have told me," she said, tears streaming down her face. "You should have given me the choice to decide for myself." "I know," he said softly. "And I'm sorry. I didn't want to lose you." Their conversation was interrupted by the lead guard, who stepped forward. "Your Highness, we must leave soon. The palace needs you." Okoye nodded, then turned back to Nayeli. "They've dealt with the people who wanted to harm me," he explained. "It's safe for me to return now, but I don't want to go without you." Nayeli's breath caught in her throat. "You want me to go with you? To the palace?" "I do," he said, his voice earnest. "You're my wife, Nayeli. I want you by my side, not just as my queen, but as the woman who taught me what it means to live, to love, and to hope." Nayeli didn't know what to say. Her mind was a whirlwind of emotions. Shock, anger, confusion, and something else she couldn't quite name. She looked at the guards, the horses, the regal bearing of the man she thought she knew, and then at the life they had built together. It all felt so surreal, like a story someone else was living. "I need time," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is a lot to take in." Okoye nodded, his expression softening. "Take all the time you need. I'm not leaving without you." That evening Nayeli sat alone, staring at the stars. Her mind replayed every moment she had shared with Okoye, from their awkward beginnings to the quiet moments of companionship they had come to share. She thought about the kindness he had shown her, the way he had stood by her, even when she had pushed him away. He had saved her life, not just from the wild boar, but from the emptiness she had felt after her father's death and her stepmother's cruelty. And yet, she couldn't ignore the secrets he had kept from her, the life he had hidden. She felt a pang of regret for the way she had treated him in the beginning, for not seeing the man beneath the humble exterior. But could she trust him now, knowing who he truly was? The next morning, she found Okoye sitting on the porch, his gaze fixed on the horizon. He turned when he heard her approach, his eyes filled with hope and uncertainty. "I've made my decision," she said, her voice steady. He stood, his heart pounding. "And?" Nayeli took a deep breath. "I'll go with you, but this doesn't mean I've forgiven you for keeping this from me. You'll have to earn my trust again." A smile broke across his face, one of pure relief and gratitude. "I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you," he promised. As the royal guards prepared to escort them to the palace, Nayeli couldn't help but feel a sense of trepidation. She was leaving behind the life she had known, stepping into a world of opulence, power, and intrigue. But as she looked at Okoye, she realized she wasn't stepping into it alone. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. As the carriage pulled away from the farm, Nayeli glanced back at the place that had become her sanctuary, the place where she had learned to hope again. And though she didn't know what the future held, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't felt in a long time, possibility. The journey to the palace was long but filled with an air of anticipation. Nayeli sat quietly beside Okoye in the gilded carriage, her emotions swirling like a storm. She had agreed to join him, to stand by his side as his wife and future queen, but the weight of the decision still lingered. Okoye, sensing her unease, reached out and took her hand. His touch was warm and reassuring. "You don't have to decide everything now," he said softly. "All I ask is that you let me prove to you that I'm worthy of your trust." Nayeli met his gaze, her heart softening. "You've already started," she replied, her voice tinged with a fragile smile. As the carriage drew closer to the village, Nayeli's resolve hardened. She knew there was one more thing she needed to do before stepping fully into her new life. She asked Okoye to make a stop at her stepmother Ayo's house, and though he hesitated, he agreed, understanding the importance of this confrontation. When the carriage arrived at the modest home, villagers gathered, whispering in awe at the sight of the royal entourage. Ayo emerged from the house, her face twisting in confusion and disbelief as she saw Nayeli step out, draped in regal attire and jewels that glimmered in the sunlight. Okoye followed, his commanding presence leaving no doubt about his status. Ayo's expression shifted from confusion to shock. "Nayeli, what is this? What are you doing here, dressed like that?" Nayeli straightened her back, her voice steady and resolute. "I've come to show you the life you said I didn't deserve. You thought you could belittle me, humiliate me, and sell me off to a man you believed was beneath me. But you were wrong." Ayo's eyes darted to Okoye, her face paling as realization dawned. He's a prince." "Yes," Nayeli said, her tone sharp. "And you forced me to marry him without a second thought, just to rid yourself of me. You didn't care about my happiness or my future, but I'm here to tell you that you no longer have power over me." Ayo stumbled, her arrogance crumbling under the weight of her shame. "Nayeli, No," Nayeli cut her off. "You don't get to explain or justify your actions. You treated me like I was nothing, but I found my worth. I am more than you ever saw in me, and I will not let your cruelty define my life anymore." The villagers murmured among themselves, some casting disapproving glances at Ayo. For the first time, Nayeli felt a sense of freedom, as though a heavy chain had been broken. Okoye stepped forward, his calm but authoritative voice adding weight to Nayeli's words. "Nayeli is my wife and the future queen of Eldora," he announced. "She has shown strength and grace, that many in the highest courts could never match, and she will be treated with the respect she deserves. Io stood speechless, her pride shattered. Nayeli turned away, her heart lighter than it had been in years. She had faced her past and emerged stronger, ready to embrace the life ahead of her. The palace was unlike anything Nayeli had ever imagined. Its towering walls were adorned with intricate carvings, and the grand halls glittered with chandeliers that seemed to capture the light of 1,000 stars. Servants and nobles alike bowed as she passed, their eyes filled with curiosity and admiration. A grand celebration was held to welcome the prince's return and introduce Nayeli as the future queen. The palace buzzed with activity, from the preparation of lavish feasts to the arrangement of flowers that filled the air with their sweet fragrance. Nayeli felt a mixture of awe and nervousness as she stood at the center of it all, dressed in a gown that seemed to shimmer with every step she took. As the ceremony began, Okoye stood before the gathered crowd, his voice strong and unwavering. Today, we celebrate not just my return, but the woman who has given me strength and hope. Nayeli has shown me the beauty of resilience, kindness, and love. It is with great honor that I present her as your future queen. The crowd erupted in applause, their cheers echoing through the hall. Nayeli stepped forward, her heart pounding. She had never sought power or prestige, but as she looked out at the faces of the people, she felt a sense of purpose. She knew the struggles of the common folk, the pain of being overlooked and undervalued. And now, she had the chance to make a difference. As the crown was placed on her head, Nayeli's eyes met Okoye's, and she saw pride and love reflected in his gaze. She took his hand, the weight of the crown a reminder of the responsibility she now bore, but also of the strength she had gained. In the weeks and months that followed, Nayeli embraced her new role with determination and compassion. She worked alongside Okoye to implement changes that would uplift the lives of the kingdom's people, particularly those who had been oppressed or marginalized. Drawing from her own experiences, she championed education and opportunities for women, ensuring that no one would feel as powerless as she once had. The palace became a place of hope and progress, its gates open to those seeking aid and justice. Nayeli's warmth and humility won the hearts of the people, who admired her not just as their queen, but as someone who truly understood their struggles. One evening, as Nayeli and Okoye stood on the palace balcony overlooking the bustling city, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The stars above seemed to shine brighter, their light a reminder of how far she had come. "Thank you," Nayeli said, her voice soft but filled with emotion. "For what?" Okoye asked, wrapping an arm around her. "For believing in me," she replied. "For showing me that even in the darkest times, there's always a chance for a new beginning." Okoye smiled, pulling her closer. "You're the one who taught me that," he said, "and I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you never forget it." As they stood together, the past felt like a distant memory, replaced by a future filled with love, purpose, and endless possibilities. Nayeli had found not just her place in the world, but also the strength to shape it into something brighter for everyone.